Okay, we are holding in Perek Memhei Pasuk Yud Gimel. Vehi garatem la'avi es kol kevodi b'Mitzrayim ve'es kol asher isem umi hartem v'hoiradetem es avihena. So firstly a word on ve'es kol asher isem. There's a stress over here that they have to recount what they saw, and this continues a theme from the previous pasuk, Pasuk Yud Beis, where Yosef stresses their eyes are seeing. Now, what's the significance of their eyes seeing? And now Pasuk Yud Gimel saying, make sure to recount all that you've seen. So this we've discussed in parallel with Yeshaya, Perek Lamed, and I needn't repeat here all the parallels and why we keep on going back to Yeshaya, Perek Tes, and Lamed. For that, you can see all the previous shurim. For these purposes, for the purposes of this pasuk, we're going to focus now. We're going to get to a lot of things in that parak, but now we want to point out to you pasuk Chaf in Perek Lamed in Yeshaya, which says, "V'lo yikonef oid meirecha v'hayu einecha ro'os es meirecha." Your guide will no longer hide, and your eyes will see your guide. Yosef, who's guiding Bnei Yisrael down to Mitzrayim, was in hiding. He comes out of hiding. He was in disguise. He comes out of hiding. He's no longer hiding, and now their eyes see. So there's a focus on the eyes seeing. The eyes seeing is also mentioned there in Perek Lamed and Yeshaya, where it says in Pasuk Yud that the children who don't listen to Hashem or don't follow Hashem's dictates, specifically they go down to Mitzrayim without asking Hashem's permission. This is in Perek Lamed, that's in Perek Pasuk Beis. Ufi lo sha'alu. They don't ask the mouth Hashem. These same people tell the seers lo siru, the prophets. Perek Lamed Pasuk Yud asher amru l'ro'im lo siru. So there's this anti-visionary stance. People who don't want to hear the mouth of Hashem and don't want to see the visions of Hashem. And this is something that we've been tracing through and tracking through the whole story of Yosef and the brothers. There's this theme of whether Nevuah is going to be operative or they're going to instead act without guidance from Hashem. Yosef stands in this in-between place because on the one hand he's representing Hashem's guidance, on the other hand he's not a prophet. But either way, we don't have to go into the pratim of that, even though it's going to come up tonight and it keeps on coming up. The point is that when Yosef finally is reunited with his brothers, there is a return of prophecy. V'techi ruach Yaakov aviyam, when Yaakov saw Vayares or Agolis, when he has a vision. And this takes us back to, of course, as we discussed this at length, when vision was lost. That's in the beginning of Parshas Vayeshev, when the pasuk says, "Vayisu eineihem vayiru v'hine orchas yishma'elim ba'am migilot," etc. That was a failed nisias ayin, a failed vision, or failed re'iyah. That's when the brothers lost their abilities to be seers, and it was returned when Yosef sent agolos loses. So instead of vayisu eineihem vayiru, and they saw gemalim noisim, Yosef sends similarly agolim noisim and asor chavers noisim nois, as we discussed, asor chamarim noisim itum zayim and asor nois, etc., etc. I'm not going to repeat this. Is from last year. Okay, so the point that the Yunenu is just that es kol asher isem is continuing this point that he's telling them, you are having visions once again. And furthermore, when he says, Fi hamadaber aleichem, the significance of Fi, it's my mouth, that parallels what it says in Yeshaya Perek Lamed, Ufi lo sha'alu, that there was a problem that they're going down the time without asking my mouth, capital M, the mouth of Hashem. And Yosef says, Koyomar bincha Yosef. But that Koyomar tells us that he sees himself as speaking for Hashem. And therefore he says, look, it's P. You're having visions, you're having audio kinds of revelations and visual kinds of revelations because you're seeing me and you're hearing me, and I speak for Hashem. It's not you that did this, it's Hashem, and I am his mouthpiece. Okay, which is of course fraught. I wanted to point out, I'm not sure if we mentioned this last year, in Perek Lamed Pasuk Vav, there's a masa. We spoke about masa, about the significance of masa. Masa, and we wanted to relate the masa of the Nevuah as in a lifting up the eyes. Whenever the Nevi'im have a vision, they're supposed to lift up their eyes and see something. Of course, lift up your eyes to the heaven, because that's where messages come from. So that's what a masa is, and there it says in Yeshaya Perek Lamed Pasuk Vav, there's a masa of the animals that go down to the south, and these animals go down to Mitzrayim, and they carry all sorts of riches. Al am lo yo'ilu, to a nation that doesn't help. Mitzrayim hevel varikya azoru. So there's this masa of all these animals that are bearing riches to go down to Mitzrayim to bribe them, and they're going in this dangerous desert. And it's all because they think that it's worth getting on the good side of Egypt. And the Navi says that you're just endangering yourself for nothing because Mitzrayim Hevel Varikya Azayru. So similarly, we have the Gemalehem Noisim Mitzrayim, but that's the first matter of taking things down to Mitzrayim. And then there's Yaakov says, take down gifts to Mitzrayim, and Parai sends Agalus to carry down Yaakov to Mitzrayim, and to carry wealth away from Mitzrayim to Yaakov, the food from Mitzrayim, then to bring Yaakov down to Mitzrayim. So basically the theme is, what do we want to send down to Mitzrayim? In other words, do we need to appeal to Mitzrayim and bring them bribes so that they should support us? Or what it says in Yeshaya is, no. That's not what Hashem wants. Ask Hashem, and what are you going to do if you ask Hashem? You're going to send down Yaakov, because Yaakov ultimately goes down to Mitzrayim, and this is the beginning of Perek Mavav, but he waits for Hashem. He gets a message from Hashem, go. So then Yaakov goes down to Mitzrayim, and then Yaakov ends up being the salvation of Mitzrayim, because as we discussed, the Rav comes to an end. So everyone thinks you have to get on Mitzrayim's good side. And everyone thinks you have to send Mitzrayim bribes and exotic spices and the like from foreign lands so that they'll give you the food. But really, as Yeshaya says, it's am lo yo'ilu. You're wasting your time with your camels. It talks about the camels and their humps. Gemalim oitzoisam alam lo yo'ilu. Instead, what we need is Yaakov to go down to Mitzrayim. Okay. The end of the pasuk, Yud Gimel, umihartem vayiradatem es aviheno. This mihartem is like, he began his soliloquy by saying, well, not quite began, but he said, Maharu, he began his commandments to them, Maharu va'alu elavis. Everything has to be done quickly. Everything must be done quickly, and this is referenced by the Navi Yirmiyah in Perek Chaf Beis, Chaf Gimel, who says, Lo shalachti es hanaviim vehem ratzu, lo dibati aleim vehem neba'u. Yosef is running, but he's actually not sent. So he says, Hashem sent me, koyam ben Yosef, as if he's a Navi, but he's actually not sent, and the Navi calls him out for that. This is not koyam Hashem. Instead, what does happen quickly, what it says in Mizmar Kuf Mem Zayin, the one we keep on going back to, is Lo b'gvuras asosiach, but lo b'shokir she'yatzeroitz Hashem b'zirei of Yerev is Yaakov, and he is associated with Shalayim and Tzion. He's the one who's supposed to get the Chel of Chitim, which we'll soon see Parai is promising him, Chel of Haaretz. Hashalech and Masoratz and Meheri Devora. You want to know what comes quickly? The word of Hashem. And that's associated with rain, which is the source of sustenance, not from Mitzrayim, but for Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the Mizmar ends Magid Dvar Yaakov, Chukav Mishpatav Yisrael Lo Yasachin L'Chol Goy. So Parai Mishpatim Lo Yedom, like Parai says Lo Yodati Es Hashem, and the only one that really gets the word of Hashem Mehera is Yaakov. Shalech Imarsei Oretz Ad Mehera It's Devarim Nosin Shalakatzameh. So the rain is a symbol of the word of Hashem that comes down Mehera, and only Yaakov can access that, not the Chol Goy, which is Parai. So Yosef, who sort of aligned himself with Parai because he said, Elikim Yana Shloim Parai, he's promising, or he's worried about something happening quickly. Mimaherha Elikim La'asei Soy. the hunger, and he says if we have to hurry and bring down Yaakov, really the irony is that actually when Yaakov comes, the hunger comes to an end. So is there a rush to bring down Yaakov because of a hunger? Well, not because it's going to be another 5 years of hunger, but rather because Yaakov is like the Dvar Hashem, is going to bring down the Dvar Hashem on Meir Yotz Devar, which is rain, which is a blessing that Yaakov brings to Mitzrayim and puts an end to the Rav, because he's not like Kol Goy. Okay. Pasuk Yudalid. Vayipol al tzaveri Binyamin achi vayev ko Binyamin bacha al tzaverav. Now let's go back. This theme of crying, and as we'll soon see, the further psukim in this parsha are all explicated. Well, I don't know about all, but a lot of the points in the psukim are explicated or played on by Yeshaya Hanavi in Perek Lamed. So we previously looked at a few psukim that we looked at Pasuk Chaf, which says you'll see your guide. And by the way, the next pasuk says your ears will hear a word saying, "Here's the way you should go." That's Yosef telling them, "Here's what you got to do," as if he knows, as if he's speaking for God and knows what they have to do. And there's a certain truth to it. Because what happens is and this is still requires understanding where the truth lies over here. Because what happens is, as I mentioned before, Yosef stands sort of in between because he's speaking for Hashem, but he's not quite a navi. But what he does is by them listening to him, he causes the brothers, the family, to get back together, and then Yaakov, and then he gets an actual nevuah. So Yosef serves as this bridge between Hester and true nevuah. So he's not to be rejected completely. Okay, now the pasuk prior to pasuk Chaf, pasuk Yutes, says Am b'Tzion yeshev Yerushalayim. You could live in Tzion and Yerushalayim. B'chol le'sivke. Don't cry. Okay, Hashem will be chaynin you. Now, Yosef cried twice regarding Binyamin. The first time he told Malakim Yochnecha Bani, and here he cries with him again. And the pasuk is saying you don't need to cry. And then look at the pasuk Chaf. The beginning of pasuk Chaf says V'nosim lachem Hashem lechem tzar umayim lachatz. So as we discussed, which means you could have a small amount of bread and then no need to cry. As we discussed, there's a hunger in Mitzrayim that takes back the beginning of Parshas Vikes, and Yosef says, "Okay, I'm going to save Egypt from hunger." How does he save Egypt from hunger? By committing himself to Shloim Parei, by becoming a Parei kind of person. Now, he didn't necessarily have to do that. He could have accepted Lechem Tsar and Mayim Lachatz. And then, Am B'Tzion Yeshev B'Yerushalayim, he wouldn't have had to commit himself to being associated with the land of Mitzrayim. And look at a few psukim prior to that, in Lamed Tezvav, it says, Hashem says, I'll offer you a salvation, B'Shuva V'Nachas, but you don't want that. You want to run on a horse. It means you want power. Like it says, and as we discussed, by Richos, those psukim are contrasting Yosef, who was powerful, strong. He has the sheker ish, he could stand in front of the king, in the heichal of the king, which requires maybe standing for long hours consecutively. And then there's Yaakov, who's exactly 100 years older than that, and he cannot even stand. He does not have the sheker ish, but he's roitz Hashem esirei, and that's what's relying on Hashem and doesn't need the Gvuras Hasus, doesn't need the salvation of Mitzrayim. He's happy with whatever Hashem gives him, even if it's lechem tzar mayim lachat. So Yaakov, from his standpoint, had he been in the position of facing the hunger in Mitzrayim and okay, there's a big hunger, what am I supposed to do? He said, no problem. I'm not going to commit to Mitzrayim. I'm going to live in Tzion and Yerushalayim, and I'm going to live on lechem tzar mayim lachatz, and so be it, because I don't want the power of the sus. I want the Dvar Hashem, and that brings us to Dvar Hashem Shemayim Nasu Mizmor Lamed Gimel, where it says Sheker Hasus Hine Ein Hashem Elirei Av Lamaychel Lachaste Wat Lahatzim Mavos Nashchasim Bara'ov. So you can live on the Dvar Hashem, and of course this takes us back to Amos Leirav Lalechem Leitzam Alamayim Kim Rav L'Shema Dvar Hashem. The real Rav is symbolic of the lack of the Davar, and that goes back to the beginning of Vayeshev Av Hashem As Davar, but we can't keep on repeating ourselves, so we hope everyone's keeping up. But I want to show you what's happening here in Mizmor, and in Yeshaya Perek Lamed, as it relates to the fact that Yosef is crying when he meets Binyamin. So Yeshaya says, no need to cry. And what's the alternative that Yeshaya is putting forth? Stay in Tzion, stay in Yerushalayim means don't identify with Gauls. Here Yosef is crying. Why? Because Very nice he's reunited with his brothers, but it's in a very anguished and problematic kind of reunion, where although they stand for Shabbat Yerushalayim, Hashem, so the fact that the Klal Yisrael is back together is reminiscent of Tzion and Yerushalayim, and they're going to live in Goshen, which, as we discussed, there's a place in Eretz called Goshen, and Goshen is like Goshen Eretz Yisrael, as we discussed. Nonetheless, they're doing this in a very fraught kind of way, where they're in Mitzrayim. So Yosef is not fully breaking away from Mitzrayim and going back to Tzion and Yerushalayim, and therefore he does cry. Now, what does that mean? That means that, again, Yosef is this in-between kind of figure. On the one hand, he's the one that affects the reunion of Bnei Yisrael and the return of Nebuah to Yaakov. But on the other hand, he affects it in a very difficult, fraught kind of situation, which is within Mitzrayim, and that tells us that yes, Mitzrayim is going to be the place of where everything's going to work out, because everything is happening here through the Hashgacha of Hashem. When he says there's truth to that. However, it's going to happen in a very painful, difficult way, because Yosef is dabbling in Hester instead of saying, I'm just sticking with the Dvar Hashem, whatever Hashem gives me is all I want. He is engaging with Mitzrayim. And this takes us further into the psukim in Yishai Perek Lamed. I want to show you, let's jump ahead a little bit for now. Let's jump ahead to Pasuk Chav Zayin. Hine Shem Hashem mimerchak haba mimerchak. So the Shem Hashem is coming from afar. And just to give you a sense of what's going on over here, this is specifically the proximate circumstances that Yishai is referring to is the defeat of Ashur. But for the defeat of Ashur, he uses themes from the battle against Mitzrayim for obvious reasons. One major reason is because the camp of Ashur is going to be wiped out in a way that's reminiscent of Makas Bechoros, where we're going to be in Yerushalayim and safe, and they're going to be decimated right there around Yerushalayim. Like Makas Bechoros, there was a differentiation between the Mitzrayim and Bnei Yisrael. Also, because Yishai was railing against those who sought aid from Mitzrayim, and he says, "No, we're Samech on Hashem." Okay, so there, what happens is like this: the Shem Hashem comes Mimerchak, and it's burning and kovid masa. And this, of course, means, in simple reading, means that it's going to be directed against Ashur. And notice, okay, just read on a little bit. It's like a stream that goes up to the neck. And it's like a bit that leads astray. So you could take an animal and you could put a bit on it, but you take it the wrong direction. So basically, there's the Shem Hashem. It's coming from far and it's burning, and it's going to lead the nations astray. Okay. And it reaches to the Tzavar. So now I maintain like this, that Yosef crying on the Tzavar tells us that, okay, this is all going to work out, but it's going to work out with pain. And the fact that it's going to work out with pain is related to the fact that the Shem Hashem is coming mimerchak and it's burning. Why? Because coming mimerchak means it doesn't really belong here. It doesn't really belong in Mitzrayim. And Yosef, if you remember, Yosef dabbles in this idea that God is distant, which Yirmiyah Perek of Gimel says, no, God is not distant. But Yosef thinks God is distant. Okay, so even when the salvation will come, it's going to come in a way that God is distant, which means that it's going to come in such a way that we also, the ones who are being saved, are going to have suffering. And this is what we see in Yirmiyah, in Yishai Perek Lamed, as I read on, that there's a mixture of both salvation and great danger and some sacrifice that Bnei Yisrael themselves have to give in order to merit the redemption. Okay, so the two things go together. Meaning, and this is why it's a little bit complicated, because just like in the Yosef story, on the one hand he's affecting a reunion, but on the other hand he's doing it in Mitzrayim. So there's a poignancy. He's crying at the reunion with his brother, which of course, obviously, Pshat is crying. It's very emotional. But the fact is, he's crying. It means that this is not pure, unadulterated joy. Similarly, it's foreshadowing that the history of Bnei Yisrael Mitzrayim, which now is being set up. Okay, yes, you belong to Mitzrayim. It's going to be you belong to Mitzrayim, and it's all going to work out, but it's going to happen through suffering. And we have the same thing in Yishai Perek Lamed. Okay, so on the one hand, it says Hashem's coming. And I said, no, al tzavar yechetze. Okay, so that's like the neck. The next pasuk is Ashir Yelachem Kalil Hiskadesh Chag, which of course Chazal say is it's like the night of Pesach. Okay, and V'yashmiya Hashem as Hoid Koiloi, B'za Af and Lahav Eish and Barad, of course reminds us of Mitzrayim. Koil Hashem Yechas Ashur, fine, and hell is arranged. Lamelech Huchan, prepared for the king. Okay, and then the next parak Lamed Aleph, begins with a call against those that go down to Mitzrayim for aid, and they rely on the horses. Okay, old theme. And there it goes like this, and this is something I spoke about in the past. It says like following, and this is a description or a mashal, a symbol for the defeat of Asher and the salvation of Yerushalayim. Like a lion, says the Navi, Perek Lamed Aleph Pasuk Dalet, protects its prey, and all the shepherds gather around the lion to try to save the sheep, but he's not afraid of them. So too Hashem is going to protect Har Tzion. And then it says, Gonoin v'hitzil pasayach v'himlet. So pasayach is like he's jumping over the Pesach. So Har Tzion is going to be protected. Har Tzion is going to be protected. Why? And Asher is going to be wiped out, and Har Tzion is going to be protected. And Asher is going to be wiped out miraculously, b'cherv lo'ish, in a divine sword. Why? Because the lion protects his prey from the shepherd. So what the pasuk is saying is like this: that Hashem is going to protect Har Tzion, because Har Tzion is Hashem's prey. So why is Hashem not allowing Ashur to wipe out Har Tzion? Because he wants to eat Har Tzion, which is reminiscent, of course, of Makas Becheres, where Hashem saved the Batei B'nai Yisrael, but only because they put blood on the mashkev. So that means they're sacrificing. That's what I said before. That the salvation from Ashur, like the salvation from Mitzrayim, comes along with sacrifice. And that's because whenever we're bringing Hashem to a place where he doesn't belong, which is to say we're dabbling in Hester, what that means is that yes, it will work out, but it's going to work out in painful, unexpected ways. Okay, so therefore Yosef, that's why Yosef is crying. That's the punchline. Now I just want to wrap up this sushta from that parak. Notice before we said the pasuk Lamed Perek Lamed Pasuk Chav Ches talks about a bit that's mas'eh, will lead them astray, and Perek Chav Tes spoke about the to'e ruach, will learn bina. The to'e ruach, beginning of Perek Lamed, says are those who go down to Mitzrayim without asking Hashem. And Yosef was the isha ruach boy, ruach lekim boy, and really the Navi calls him a to'e ruach, because he's actually maseh. But what's interesting, as what he says in Perek Lamed Pasuk Chav Ches, is that it's a resen maseh al choye amim, which means to say that ultimately the ones who go astray due to Yosef's straying are not his own people, but rather his hosts, l'choye amim. So Yosef's te'iyah, the fact that Yosef is a toye ruach, instead of accepting the lechem tzar mayim lachatz, saying I don't want to have anything to do with Mitzrayim, ends up leading Mitzrayim to be toye. And the toye ruach learn bina, and they come back to Hashem. Okay. That's one thing. And then, in the end of previously in Perek Lamed, where it talks about the lechem tzar mayim lachatz, and then you're going to hear which way to go. Pasuk Chav Beis, Perek Lamed, Pasuk Chav Beis, v'tim meisem es tzipor psilech aspecha v'safedas v'es afudas masechas zehavecha tezim k'moy davot tzei toimar loy. Okay, you're going to reject and consider impure the psilim and the afeda and the masecha, like a nida. Like a nida, that's like Rachel, who said, hid the trufim and said, derech noshim hili. So, similarly, Yosef, who continues in the tradition of Rachel and says, Nachesh Nachesh Kamoini, he's a Menachesh, he's dabbling in this kind of dark arts, which is, of course, associated with distance from Hashem. Eventually, we're going to come back around and recognize that has to be rejected, and that's how Perek Lamed Aleph ends. Which, like I said, is reminiscent of Mitzrayim, when we reject Avodah Zarah and Shecht, the Pesach. Okay, but that takes us a long time till we come around to that, because we're still struggling with Avodah Zarah, because we're doing things the Yosef way and not waiting for pure nevuah from Hashem. Okay, that's that. Now let's move on to Perik Tesvav. Vayinashek Pasuk Tesvav. I'm sorry. Perik Mem Pasuk Tesvav. Vayinashek l'cholecha vayivk aleihem. That means that only then did they speak to him, as we read earlier. Pasuk Gimel. They couldn't speak, and since they couldn't speak, Yosef spoke for a very long time, and only after he kissed them were they able to speak. And of course, the major question is who has the power of speech. Brings us back to the beginning. Vayeshev Aviv Shamar Es Hadavar. They lost the power of speech, and Yosef is the one who restored it, which brings us back to the point I was saying before, that the question is who has the davar, which is, of course, the davar is the word of Hashem. Are there any other words are not worth anything? And when Yosef eventually says, Pi Hamadaber Aleichem, he's reclaiming davar, and he reclaims it in dramatic fashion by speaking for about 10 psukim, and only then do they speak. Only after he finishes and he kisses them. Now this kol nishma, we had the kol being heard already. This is in pasuk beis. But there was just a kol of bechi with nobody knew what. Now they knew. Now the kol was bo'u achei Yosef. So now instead of some confusion, something's going on. Now they knew what, which is bo'u achei Yosef. Yosef brought this whole dramatic showdown to a conclusion, to a rapprochement, a conclusion of love, where it was recognized that these are the brothers of Yosef and they're here because they're Yosef's brothers. And of course, it could have ended much differently. It could have ended that they were Yosef's enemies, and it could have ended in some sort of showdown or fight. Instead, this is how it was resolved. Ba'u achei Yosef, and they were very happy about this. Now, the koil, right? We have the koil twice, pasuk beis, right? And then by koil nishma beis pari. This reminds us of Yeshaya Perik Lamed, where the koil of Hashem is going to decimate Ashur. This is in Perik Lamed, pasuk Lamed. V'shmi Hashem as hoid koiloi, and the barad, and the next pasuk koil Hashem yeichas Ashur. So there's the koil. There's a koil of Yosef here, whose mouth speaks for Hashem. Vayitin as koil of Bechi. His mouth speaks for Hashem, and that koil is Bechi because it indicates that there's going to be suffering for Bnei Yisrael as well. But here the koil comes to base pare, and remember we mentioned earlier the pasuk over there says tofta, which is another name for sha'oil, hell, was prepared for the king. So a koil nishma base pare is what's the word I'm looking for? Evocative, or not reminiscent, but suggestive of the fact that there's a koil, a divine koil that's going to ultimately come around to haunt the house of Pare. This is the Resen Maseh. He's being led astray because he thinks it's good for him. And he thinks it's good for him because he thinks Yosef is the best thing that ever happened to him, some say, or he likes Yosef, so he's very happy for Yosef, but ultimately it's going to end up being his downfall. Okay. Pasuk Yud Zayin. Oh, I just want to make one more comment. This Vayita Be'ini Par B'nei Avodav, we have a similar lashon in Parshas Vayishlach, where there's a possibility of the family of Yaakov living together with Shechem and partnering with them, and there it says Vayitvu Devreihem, Vayitvu Devreihem Be'enei Chamor Ve'enei Shechem Be'chamor. So whenever there's this possibility of Bnei Yisrael being together with an Am in peace, so that's called Vayitvu Be'eneihem. Okay, but didn't work out there and doesn't work out here. Pasuk Yudzayin Ve'yom Paral Yosef Emor Alechecha Zois Asu. Tell your brothers Zois Asu. So firstly, I want to comment on this interesting expression Zois Asu. Zois Asu has been happening with a lot of frequency, with some frequency, I should say. It starts when Yosef told the brothers in Perek Mem Beis Pasuk Yudches Zois Asu V'chiu. Here's what you should do. And then when Yaakov gave them instructions about bringing down this bribe or this gift, Perek Mem Gimel, Pasuk Yud Aleph, bring down the gift to the Adonai Haaretz, he says, Im Kirefe Zois Asu. And here Pare says to Yosef, Zois Asu. And he says it again in Pasuk Yutes, V'ata Tzuveis Zois Asu. So I have to think about this more, but it seems like there's a question of who's calling the shots, who's telling everyone what to do. Yosef tries to do it, Pare tries to do it. Yaakov tries to do it. Who's really doing it? And here we have Paro doing it twice. And notice, remember we said that it says in Yeshaya, they go down to Mitzrayim, Upi lo yishalu, don't ask Hashem. And Yosef says, Pi hamadaber aleichem. And here, notice the Agolas were sent to Yaakov, Al Pi Faroi. Pasuk Chaf Aleph. Vayitem Yosef Agolas Al Pi Faroi. So whose mouth is calling the shots? Is it Hashem's mouth? Is it Yosef's mouth? Is it Paro's mouth? And who is saying what to do? Is it Yaakov? Is it Yosef? Or is it Paro? Now here, let's spoke about the fact that it's happening twice over here. That the Zoysasu happens twice in Pasuk Yud Zayin and Pasuk Yud Tes. There's a major difference. Because in Pasuk Yud Zayin, Yosef tells his brother, Paro tells Yosef, tell your brothers, quote, Zoysasu. So he's telling Yosef to tell his brothers, here's what you should do. It's mashma that Yosef is calling the shots, and Paro is giving him permission to command them what to do. But in Pasuk Yud Tes, Paro says to Yosef, Va'atotzu veisa, you are commanded, Zoysasu. Which means that Paro is calling the shots to Yosef, and Yosef is not the commander, but the one who's being commanded. And in fact, that dichotomy, or that difference between is Yosef being commanded or is Yosef being commanded, is he doing the commanding or is being told what to do? We see that further in the parasha where it says that, okay, this is in Pasuk Chav Zayin, Yaakov sees the Agolos Asher Sholach Yosef Losis Oisai. While in the next parak, Parak Mavav, Pasuk Hey, it says that they carried him Ba'agolos Asher Sholach Paro Losis Oisai. So who sent them? Was it Paro or Yosef? The answer is, well, there's two ways to look at this. Because Paro said, Yosef, here's what you should tell them, do such and such. And Paro also said to Yosef, you are commanded, do such and such. So there's a tension between, is he deferring to Yosef or allowing him to tell them what to do, or is Paro telling them what to do? It still needs to be explained, but it seems to be in line with this question of whose word are we living by? Are we living by the word of Hashem? And the word of Hashem would be Pi lo sha'alu, or the word of Hashem that comes to Yaakov and says, go down to Mitzrayim, or perhaps the word of Yaakov who says Zoysasu, and maybe Yaakov speaks for Hashem. Or are we living by Pi Faroi, like it says in Pasuk Chav Aleph, Al Pi Faroi, and that's of course the inverse of Pi Lo Sha'alu, not asking Hashem, and that's Paro saying Zoysasu Vayasu Chein Bnei Yisrael, Pasuk Chav Aleph, like Paro is the one who's giving the mitzvah, telling you what to do. Or is it, like I said, is it Yaakov speaking for Hashem? Is it Paro, or is it something in between? Is it Yosef? Kifi hamadaber aleichem and Zoysasu, which is Yosef. So it still needs to be explained exactly how the two things. In other words, I'm noting that there's two Zoysasus, one in Pasuk Yud Zayin, one in Pasuk Yud Tes, and they're very different because the Pasuk Yud Zayin is telling Yosef to say Zoysasu, and Pasuk Yud Tes is telling Yosef, you are commanded to do the following. So there's a major difference, but we have to explain why that comes in the middle, and whether this, and why sometimes the Agolos are called the ones that Paro sent, sometimes they're called the ones that Yosef sent, specifically in those contexts. So there's still things to be understood over here, and I think there's still more to understand about this Zois Asu. Okay. And by the way, we have a similar thing in the next pasuk where it says, I just want to comment one more thing. Ta'anu es be'irchem. Ta'anu es be'irchem. What does ta'anu mean? So some say ta'anu means like in Chazal, te'una, loaded up. So like we have the word earlier in the Chumash, we have vaya'amois in Perek Medal Pasuk Yud Gimel. Vaya'amois means to load up. We don't find that ta'anu means to load up in Lashon HaMikra. We find it in the Mishnah. So some say, ta'anu means like what imsu means earlier. But this leads to a great problem, which is that Paro is telling them to load up their animals, but if you're keeping track, the animals were already loaded. Because the pasuk specifically says, the pasuk we just referenced, they loaded up their animals. They came back to the city. They fall in front of Yosef. Yehuda approaches them and so on and so forth. And Yosef's son Yosef. So why is Paro saying now, load up your animals if they were loaded? Okay, of course you could say they got unloaded, but the pasuk makes the whole point about they were loaded, and then Paro says load them, so it still needs to be explained. The Radak brings a different shot that ta'anu means prod or goad them, like get them moving, and luchu voyrad zakana means get the animals going. Let's get moving. No time to waste. which would answer that problem. That they were loaded up. Okay, now let's look at pasuk Yud Ches, and we'll see there's a further question over here about who's in charge. So, did I mention before that Vayitav is like Shechem, and here also Ve'etna, give, we have that similar expression over there. So he's willing to give away his wealth so them to come live with him, and he's specifically promising them chelev ars. Now this chelev ars is very important. Last we mentioned this before, because it says in Kuf Mem Zayin, where does the chelev chitim supposed to go? Yushalayim and Tzion. It's not supposed to be in Mitzrayim. It's supposed to go back to Yushalayim and Tzion. And here, Pare is the one who's controlling it, or at least he thinks he controls it. But so it's like something in between. It's Pare's, but he's giving it away. He's the one who's a big macher. He's a big shot. He says he's the Chelev Aretz, but he's giving it to Yaakov. And this brings us to Mizmor Pei Aleph, the other one we keep on going to, where it says about Yosef going on to Mitzrayim, and there it says, Mesane Hashem yichachashu lo v'hi'itom lo'olam vaya'achileu mechidav chito mitzur devash aspieka, which we explain means he, Yosef, gave the Mesane Hashem chidav chito by guaranteeing the Shalom Pare, and really Hashem wants to mitzur devash aspieka. He wants to take care of us, and just let us come out of Mitzrayim, and then he'll take care of us, he'll fill our mouths. But instead we feed the Mesane Hashem who deny him and say, Lo yadati Hashem, we feed him chilav chita, like Yosef did to Pare. So Pare is in charge of the Chelev Aretz. At least he thinks he is. Because he denies Hashem, Mesane Hashem yichachashu lo, and he gives it back to, he thinks he's in charge of giving it out. But really, as it says further in Kuf Mem Zayin, really the wealth comes from Hashem, and loy osachin l'chol goyim mishpatim. Really the wealth comes from Hashem Aretz, and loy osachin l'chol goyim mishpatim bal yidom. Pari is not the one who's deserving of the chelev chito that he is here giving out to those who he chooses to give. So on the one hand, there's a tension over there. On the one hand, Pari is in charge. On the other hand, he's giving it away. Also, ve'etna lachem es tov eretz Mitzrayim brings us back to l'ma'an yitav li ba'avurei chos nafshi b'golech, that this whole theme of emptying out the wealth of Mitzrayim. So on the one hand, Mitzrayim is the wealthy ones, and they can decide who to give to. On the other hand, it ends up going to those who deserve it, and that indicates that really it does not belong in Mitzrayim. It's just there in a contingent kind of fashion. And we will leave it at that.